It's an honor to be here. Nuclear weapons matter because they are extremely dangerous. A single bomb can devastate a city. A nuclear war would do enormous and irreparable damage to our civilizations. There are still 17,000 nuclear weapons in the world. The current international system, NATO, U.S. alliances, treaties, and relationships, are all based in part on nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And slowly, more and more states are acquiring nuclear weapons. Today's session is about nuclear weapon-free zones. Some people say that Japan can't be part of a nuclear weapons-free zone because the power of the bomb is what keeps Japan safe. The United States guards Japan using nuclear deterrence. I want to talk a little about deterrence, nuclear deterrence, and extended nuclear deterrence. I don't think there's any doubt that deterrence works. Ordinary deterrence probably works some of the time. Harsh penalties can deter crime. And for ordinary deterrence, that's good enough. If you deter some crime, that's better than deterring no crime. If ordinary deterrence works 80% of the time, that's great. You've deterred 80% of the crime. But the issue with nuclear deterrence is different. If nuclear deterrence works 80% of the time, that's terrible. That means you have a 20% chance of a catastrophic nuclear war every time there's a crisis. 1 chance in 5. It's not good enough for nuclear deterrence to work 80% of the time. Nuclear deterrence has to work perfectly. If nuclear deterrence fails, you can have a catastrophic nuclear war, and that's unacceptable. You could say that for nuclear deterrence, failure is not an option. It has to work perfectly every time. So, has it worked perfectly every time? Proponents of nuclear weapons look at the Cold War and they say, yes, nuclear deterrence did work in every crisis, but they're ignoring important evidence. Consider Cuba. Proponents say it is classic proof that nuclear deterrence works. After all, the Soviets put missiles into Cuba. There was a risk of nuclear war, and then they pulled them out. Maybe deterrence worked against Khrushchev, but what about Kennedy? The Russians lied to him. He was angry, and he blockaded Cuba. Kennedy wasn't deterred by the danger of nuclear war. He knew that if he blockaded Cuba, he risked a nuclear war. In the week of secret meetings, when officials mapped out U.S. strategy, they mentioned the risk of nuclear war 60 times. They knew a blockade was risky. If nuclear deterrence means that leaders see a risk of nuclear war and then pull back, how is it possible to say that Kennedy was deterred? Or take the 1973 Middle East War. Proponents talk about Henry Kissinger putting U.S. nuclear forces on alert to warn the Soviets not to send troops to Egypt. See, they say, deterrence worked. But what about Saddam and Assad? Everyone knew that Israel had nuclear weapons. It had been reported in the New York Times. So why didn't the leaders of Egypt and Syria see the danger of nuclear war and pull back? They saw the danger that the Israelis might hit back with nuclear weapons, and they launched a war anyway. In 1982, Argentina's leaders ordered an attack on the Falkland Islands. Why didn't the UK's nuclear weapons deter that attack? Or take the Gulf War. Kevin Chilton, at one time commander of all U.S. nuclear forces, said in a recent scholarly article that the Gulf War is proof that deterrence works. Secretary of State James Baker delivered a letter to the Iraqis saying that if they used chemical or biological weapons, the United States would make the strongest response possible. And Saddam didn't use chemical or biological weapons. According to Chilton, this proves nuclear deterrence works. But read the letter more closely, and you'll see that it actually drew 3 red lines in the sand. Don't use chemical or biological weapons. Don't set the oil wells on fire. And don't make terroristic attacks against our friends and allies, in other words, Israel. But as we all know, the Iraqis crossed 2 of those red lines. Iraqi forces lit the oil wells on fire, and they launched Scud missiles at Israeli civilians. Does that mean that nuclear deterrence works 1 time out of 3? The evidence shows that nuclear deterrence isn't perfect. Even at the height of the Cold War, leaders saw the danger of nuclear war and still plunged ahead with risky and aggressive actions. Thankfully, none of those failures led to nuclear war, but that was the result of luck, not because nuclear deterrence works like magic. One way to see the role that luck played is the U-2 incident in the Cuban Missile Crisis. At the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, an American U-2 malfunctioned and strayed off course 300 miles into the Soviet Union. The Soviets saw the plane and scrambled MiG fighters to shoot it down. The U.S. scrambled F-102s to find it and protect it. But because it was the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the conventional air-to-air missiles had been removed from the U.S. fighters and replaced with Falcon nuclear air-to-air missiles. The only weapons that those U.S. fighters had was nuclear weapons. If those 2 groups of fighters had found each other, there would have been a nuclear detonation over the Soviet Union and probably nuclear war. They didn't find each other, but that was simply luck. Nuclear deterrence only works perfectly if you ignore some of the evidence. It clearly failed again and again. Several times we came this close to catastrophe. We got lucky. But how long can we expect our luck to last? We are simple, fallible human beings, always capable of breathtaking folly. Expecting us to be able to maintain nuclear deterrence forever without a disaster is to expect the impossible. To me, nuclear deterrence doesn't look like a sure thing. It looks a lot more like Russian roulette. if we continue to play, one day we'll all lose. Now let's think about extended nuclear deterrence. That's when a state with nuclear weapons says it will defend a state that doesn't have nuclear weapons. It will extend its nuclear umbrella over the other state. The U.S. extends nuclear deterrence over Japan. The problem with extended deterrence is that it is even shakier than regular nuclear deterrence. If you think that nuclear deterrence could fail, there's even greater reason to fear that extended deterrence will fail. If nuclear deterrence can fail when there are only two countries involved, like the US and Russia during the Cuban Missile Crisis, then how can it work when there are three countries involved? The people who want to keep nuclear weapons defend extended deterrence. They say the Middle East War of 1973 and the Falkland Islands War of 1982 were not really failures of deterrence. Nuclear deterrence really only works when the central areas, they say, the most vital areas of a country, are protected. If the Syrians and Egyptians had attacked Israel proper, instead of just the occupied territories, then nuclear deterrence would have worked. If the Argentines had attacked London, instead of some distant islands halfway around the world, then nuclear deterrence would have worked, they say. Maybe they're right. Maybe nuclear weapons are so horrible that you can only use them as weapons of last resort, when the most vital areas of your country are being threatened. But that raises a problem with extended deterrence. Because if you can't deter an attack on faraway islands, how can you deter an attack on faraway allies? If you can't deter an attack on the occupied territories, only an attack on your own territory, how can you deter an attack on your allies' territory? Sometimes people call extended deterrence the nuclear umbrella. The evidence shows it's not a very good umbrella. If nuclear weapons are dangerous, and we know they are, if nuclear deterrence is prone to failure, and we know it is, if extended nuclear deterrence is even more likely to fail, and that seems certain, then we dare not continue to rely on nuclear weapons or nuclear deterrence for safety. We need to reconsider our ideas about nuclear weapons. We have to come up with a better plan than simply waiting for catastrophe to one day take us by surprise. Fortunately, nuclear weapons do not pose an insoluble problem. Smart people, innovative people, and Japanese people have always been innovative, don't hang on to outmoded technology. More and more people understand that nuclear weapons are not wonder weapons. They are not magic. They are clumsy, outmoded technology, too large for any use. So, if it wanted to, Japan could join a nuclear weapons-free zone. It could give up the imaginary safety of nuclear weapons for the safety that comes only by facing reality. Thank you very much.